Okay, so today we have a visiting lecturer. I'm happy to introduce, proud to have him back again by popular acclaim. He was here before and talked about Chesterton and politics. Just a great friend and a good person. John Howting manages the circulation for Chronicles magazine, where he is also the assistant editor. Mr. Howting's a veteran of several political campaigns. He has served as deputy research director for the Michigan Republican Party. He's been published on a wide variety of topics, including politics, religion, and golf. Are you a golfer?
Golf fan. Big golf fan.
Oh my goodness, wow, okay. I remember, you know what an ambassador is? Well, under the ambassador is somebody called the council, right? And smaller cities have councils. In Sapporo, where we lived in Japan, the council took me and his son out to golfing, and he gave us a bucket of 50 balls each. I think I managed to hit 3 out of the 50. It's not my game, okay? Anyway, so also in G.K. Chesterton, he knows Chesterton just inside out. It's so much fun talking to him about Chesterton. His insights on Chesterton have been published in several places, including Gilbert Magazine, the official publication of the Society of G.K. Chesterton. In his spare time, Mr. Howting enjoys reading and thinking about who else? G.K. Chesterton. There's also a thing every fall in around November called the Four-Man Feast, which is based on a story written by, I think it's by Belloc, isn't it? Yeah, and it's a four-man feast, and it's kind of a protocol. You go bang on the door and you say, "In the name of God, I demand bacon and beer." Bang, 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 bang. And so what you have is an assortment of beers and bacon and all kinds of stuff. And it's more like it started out as a four-man feast, then it became a 40-man feast, now it's about an 80-man feast. It's just a riot. It's so much fun. So I meet him there every year. It's really fun. So anyway, without further ado, I welcome Mr. Howting.
Well, thank you so much. It is an honor to be back. And, the original title of the talk was Why Conservatives Must Support Liberal Education. And I've modified that talk slightly. I've modified the title slightly. The new title is Why Conservatives Must Support Liberal Education. I've added emphasis on the word must. And I want to tell you why I want to explain to you why conservatives must support liberal education. But in order to do that, I first need to tell you I need to tell you a few things about conservatism. That might take a little while, but I extend to you the same promise that King Henry VIII extended to each of his wives. I shan't keep you long. The first major conservative magazine in the United States, or maybe I should say these United States for you Southern conservatives in the room, the first major magazine in these United States was National Review. National Review was founded by William F. Buckley, Jr. Mr. Buckley was a witty, colorful man with many controversial opinions. For instance, Buckley, who was a Latin Mass-going Catholic, was a great defender of Francisco Franco, this Spanish Catholic theocratic leader. He actually praised Generalissimo Franco in the pages of his magazine, National Review. Now, you'll never see a so-called self-styled conservative doing that today. But Buckley did it in the mid-1950s. He was a big fan of Franco, very open about it. What other opinions did he have? Well, during the AIDS epidemic, and I know that this is all before everyone's time here, but you're probably familiar with the AIDS epidemic. You have this outbreak of this dangerous disease. It's killing a lot of people. Buckley he proposed mandatory tattoos on AIDS victims, one on the forearm and one on the buttocks, to keep people from unknowingly spreading the disease. The one on the forearm was to warn off junkies with their syringes, and the one on the buttocks was to warn off homosexuals with their, Now, Buckley died in 2008, but his magazine lives on till this day, although it has evolved just a bit. Well, what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. One of the National Review editors is a gentleman named David French. You might have heard of him. Now, David French is not a big fan of Francisco Franco. Okay, he is a huge proponent, defender, and venerator of the religious neutrality of the First Amendment. To give you some context, David French is an attorney, a practicing attorney who cites that religious neutrality of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in order to defend the right of Christians in the United States, as well as different religious minorities, their right in practicing their religion freely. So he relies on that religious neutrality, and he sings paeans to it. He praises it. So he's no big fan of theocratic leaders. Now, in 2019, very famously, in an interview with, I believe, the New Yorker magazine, David French defended the right of drag queens. We all know what drag queens are, right? Unfortunately. He defended the right of drag queens to rent rooms at libraries, fill those rooms with small children, and then sit before them and read stories to them. This is commonly known as Drag Queen Story Hour. David French referred to it as a blessing of liberty. A quote unquote, he said, it's a blessing of liberty that men can attire themselves thusly, rent these rooms, and display themselves thusly, and read to these small children. Blessing, I always love this amorphous liberty and freedom. I always want to ask, freedom from what? Freedom to do what? But anyways, he called this a blessing of liberty. Now, an entire book could be written on how conservatism evolved from Catholic triumphalism and Francisco Franco and AIDS tattoos to religious indifference and drag queen celebrations. Conservatism's transitioning, or maybe I should say transing, I think that's the popular term. Conservatism's transing has, in the very least, inspired a great deal of fighting. In the 1990s, that fighting centered around Patrick J. Buchanan, a former White House staffer, political commentator, and presidential candidate. Buchanan ran for president 3 times on a platform intended to conserve the American way of life as he had known it. Buchanan opposed the unrestrained flow of goods and people across America's borders, meaning he favored restricting immigration and trade. Buchanan also opposed American military intervention in the name of spreading American values because the American way of life cannot be exported, for it is uniquely American. Buchanan's vision of America was of a normal country made up of a people united around shared heroes, holidays, and history, in a word, identity. Buchanan sought to conserve a distinct American identity. We are losing our sense of who we are, Buchanan would often say while on the campaign trail. Buchanan's brand of conservatism was not widely accepted by the professional conservative pundit class. Ramesh Ponnuru, the editor of the prestigious conservative National Review, said that Buchanan was not a true conservative because he valued tribalism over ideas. Quote from Ponnuru. Conservatives tend to place a lot of emphasis, maybe too much, on the idea that ideas have consequences. They hoist their ideas up the flagpole and see who salutes. Buchananism puts its idealized social base first and then lets it drive everything else. For Pat Buchanan, loyalty to the tribe trumps any idea, end quote. Here, Ponnuru draws a dichotomy between ideas and identity. The true conservative, says Ponnuru, wants to conserve ideas associated with free market capitalism, the system by which we make money. The problem with Buchanan, according to Ponnuru, is that he sacrifices free market ideas to the interests of his tribe and their identity. Capitalism means the free flow of goods and people. By opposing the free flow of goods and people, Mr. Buchanan excommunicates himself from the cathedral or church that is conservatism, apparently. Of course, Panuru was not the only Buchanan critic. There were others. There was one particularly harsh Buchanan critic. He was a charismatic billionaire, a well-tanned charismatic billionaire. He was a real estate mogul who became a reality TV star. His name was Donald J. Trump. If you haven't heard of Pat Buchanan, you have probably heard of Donald J. Trump. How could you not have heard of him? Trump briefly competed with Buchanan for the presidential nomination of the nascent Reform Party in the 2000 election cycle. During this political contest, Trump accused Buchanan of racial bigotry and anti-Semitism. He even called Buchanan a quote-unquote Hitler lover. You can find this on YouTube. You can find some clips of Trump accusing Buchanan of these things. Several years later, however, Trump would apologize to Buchanan, then adopt Buchanan's positions on the major issues, run for president on those positions, and endure the same attacks that Buchanan had previously endured. Many of those attacks coming from the prestigious National Review. During Trump's first week in office as president, Jonah Goldberg, a contributing editor to National Review, wrote the following. Up until very recently, American exceptionalism, meaning we are a creedal nation, dedicated to certain principles reflected in our founding documents, largely defined the conservative understanding of patriotism. Trump, however, sees America more as an identity than an idea. Here again is the dichotomy. Identity versus ideas. According to Jonah Goldberg of the National Review, a conservative conserves the principles codified in the American Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. So which is it? What does a conservative primarily concern himself with? What does a conservative conserve? Is it identity or ideas? The great Southern conservative M.E. Bradford, an English professor at the University of Dallas, exhorted his readers and students to know who you are. That is the task of the conservative as understood by Bradford. Michael Oakeshott, the English conservative and professor of history at the London School of Economics, wrote in his essay on being conservative, published in 1962, that conservatives are not averse to change, but are wary of change because all change is a threat to identity, and every change is an emblem of extinction. For Oakeshott, identity is composed of associations and property, not mere abstractions. The conservative, according to Oakeshott, notices and appreciates his place in the cosmos. He has attachments to real things and people, and he prefers them to whatever supposed gain may come from radical experimentation, adventuring, or conquest. It is no wonder why nearly all of the old heavyweights of the conservative intellectual movement, those who were still alive anyways, supported Pat Buchanan when he ran for president in the early 90s. In fact, Russell Kirk, largely credited for starting the American conservative movement, served as Pat Buchanan's Michigan State campaign chairman. In a press release, Russell Kirk explained that he was backing Buchanan because, quote, Buchanan would discourage indiscriminate immigration into the United States. Kirk elaborated, our country cannot play host to all the world and still maintain its established culture, successful economy, and social cohesion. In an interview with a local reporter following his public endorsement of Buchanan, Russell Kirk and his wife Annette would further explain that they were initially drawn to Buchanan because of his opposition to two things: affirmative action programs and open immigration policies. Some of Kirk's former students and acolytes were taken aback by their mentor's support for immigration restriction. Just 3 years prior, in his economics textbook, which he wrote for high school students, Kirk had said very positive things about immigration. He seemed to be defending a more liberal, more open immigration policy. So what was going on? People were very confused. Kirk's apparent evolution on the issue of immigration explains a lot about the nature of conservatism, as well as the importance of education for the conservative. Russell Kirk's former research assistant, Wesley MacDonald, explained Kirk's apparent evolution on the issue of immigration at a Philadelphia Society meeting in April of 2005. According to Wesley MacDonald, Kirk supported immigration with assimilation. Immigration with assimilation. Immigrants who came to America and assimilated to the dominant culture were an asset, not a liability, according to Kirk. In the early 90s, however, Kirk had become convinced that assimilation was not happening as it once had. One reason: America's public school system no longer fostered assimilation to the dominant culture. Rather, it fostered multiculturalism. In his essay, The Fraud of Multiculturalism, Kirk explains that the proponents of multiculturalism, the multiculturalists, claim that the public school curriculum is far too Western or Eurocentric, that various ethnic groups who have contributed mightily to the American cultural experience have been woefully underrepresented. Kirk notes that textbooks, at the urging of multiculturalists, are evolving from tools for instruction into devices, quote, devices for increasing the self-esteem of ethnic groups. Kirk warns that a new brand of ethnic grievance studies combined with technical training were crowding out liberal education, or what we today often call classical education, or the liberal arts, or a liberal arts curriculum. One of the great effects of this classical education or liberal education is that it instills a sense of Western identity by taking the student through the Western canon and passing along to him the wisdom of the perennial philosophy. Now, what is Western identity? I just used a new term there, a confusing one. Western identity, what does that mean? Well, there's a prior question. What is Western civilization? There is no shortage of professional fundraisers in and around the conservative movement who in their fundraising letters talk about saving Western civilization. Donate to us so we can save and preserve Western civilization. But what is that? What is it? Western civilization is languages such as Greek and Latin. It is the great ballads, the great explorers, the discovery and conquering of the New World. It is Holy Scripture. It is Gregorian chant. It is a daily schedule ordered around liturgy, with working people pausing their work at noon to pray the Angelus. It is the Mass. It is the sacraments. It is a calendar filled with holidays honoring various heroes, and it is those heroes. Some became heroic by practicing the cardinal virtues. They are called warriors or knights. Others became heroic by practicing the Christian virtues. They are called saints. Western civilization is stained glass windows honoring those heroes, and it is beautiful stained glass windows teaching the poor and illiterate Bible stories. Western civilization is also art and architecture and paintings and sculptures. Western civilization is composed of a lot of things. My friend, the aforementioned Hilaire Belloc, the author of that delightful story, that the Foreman Feast is based on, he wrote, well, he's famous for saying, Europe is the faith and the faith is Europe. Belloc elaborates on that. The peculiar function of the Catholic Church in the story of our civilization has been to preserve the philosophic conquests of pagan antiquity and to expand them over an even greater range of discovery than the greatest of the ancients had commanded. There is no one acquainted with the story of Europe, of Western civilization, who does not know this to be true. the story of Europe, the story of Western civilization, the story of our civilization is the story of Catholics preserving and expanding upon the philosophic conquests of pagan antiquity. By the faith, when Belloc says Europe is the faith is Europe. By the faith, Belloc means two things: the Catholic Church and the wisdom of the perennial philosophy. That is the core of Western civilization. The keeper of the deposit of faith is a divinely protected institution, Holy Mother Church. We have a guarantee from sacred scripture that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But do we have a similar guarantee that the wisdom of the perennial philosophy will be divinely protected? Can we assume it will be handed down to our posterity? No, we don't know, and we cannot assume that. Just as we have the church conserving the deposit of faith, we need some institution, some way of conserving our inherited wisdom, and that is liberal education. Now, we need to back up for just a minute. Here we need to back up for a minute. We need to consider our identity more broadly, not just as Westerners, but as men. What is man? Man is a thinker. The object of his thinking is truth. Truth is a correspondence between the mind and reality. It is not a mere idea. An idea is something that exists in the mind, a mental construct which may or may not correspond with something in extramental reality. The perennial philosophers were not just some men who happened to have the right ideas concerning truth. They knew what questions to ask and what distinctions to make to lead others toward the truth. Aristotle was not just some guy who had the correct ideas handed to him. Through the intellectual virtue of understanding, he grasped first principles. Then he reasoned from those first principles, what we used to call science, and he arrived at new knowledge. This new knowledge was a better understanding of something he had noticed before. That is called wisdom, or knowledge of the causes of things, or knowledge of a more ultimate reality. A seventh grader notices right triangles. He notices how the A side squared, when added to the B side squared, equals the C side squared. You probably learned that when you were in 6th or 7th grade. I know I did. He will not, however, understand what causes this until he grasps the first principles of geometry, then reasons step by step, each step following necessarily from the prior, and finally arrives at the conclusion that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. The Pythagorean theorem, which is what I'm talking about, is over 40 individual proofs, together proving that a squared plus b squared necessarily equals c squared. When the student sees how one proof necessarily follows from the prior, and the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, he knows a more ultimate reality than just a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He knows what causes a squared plus b squared to necessarily equal c squared. The great philosophers of our Western patrimony took a journey that led to truth. A tradition needs to be rooted in truth, and if it is not rooted in truth, it will not be passed down for many generations. It will be abandoned and die out. Just as we pass down a squared plus b squared equals c squared because it signifies some truth, so we also pass down material things because they signify some truth. And it might be worthwhile to keep in mind St. Augustine's definition of a sign, because we're talking about signs, signification. This signifies that. A sign is that which strikes the senses and calls to mind something other than itself, not by chance. So when we're talking about a squared plus b squared equals c squared, it's a representation of the Pythagorean theorem. It is supposed to strike your sight and call to mind this longer 40-some step proof. But just as we pass that down, we also pass down these other things, other signs that signify some truth. Now, what we call culture is a collection of signs and symbols. They call to mind deeper, more spiritual meanings. They are largely material, but informed by something immaterial. As T.S. Eliot writes in his notes towards a definition of culture, culture is the incarnation of religion. The signs and symbols comprising our culture call to mind faith and wisdom. We could say they are the incarnation of faith and wisdom. And when we discard those signs and symbols, we begin to forget that faith and that wisdom. We begin to forget who we are, and an identity crisis sets in. The communion rail was a material distinction between clergy and laity. As we discard the material distinction, we begin to forget the immaterial distinction for which it stood. It is no coincidence that as female attire became less distinctly feminine, women began acting more like men, and men began treating them as such. Common sense, writes G.K. Chesterton, must be kept as an esoteric secret in the dark temple of culture. That men and women exist and are distinct from one another is indeed a matter of common sense. That may prompt some, even some self-styled conservatives, or even some in this very room, to regard material signs of male and female distinction as superfluous, mere relics from a bigoted past. And yet, when we tear down a culture with all its material signs, we find common sense disturbingly uncommon. The removal of a sign, a cultural symbol, is a public statement that the truth for which the sign stood is now considered taboo. And just as the truth's signage can be expelled from society, so too can anyone who espouses said truth. So watch it. We expelled the signs of sexual distinction. We are now in the process of expelling the truth of sexual distinction. When we expel a truth about a thing, we replace it with an idea of the thing. As we expel sexual truth, which is based in reality, we replace it with an idea which is nothing more than a mental construct. In this case, gender. And that's literally all that gender is. It's just something in your head. Supposedly there's a new one every day because there's no limit to the nonsense that you can imagine and think up in your own mind. After adopting the idea, men are habituated to view reality through the lens of this idea. This is called ideological thinking. So once you adopt gender, you start interpreting everything through gender. Once you adopt this idea, you have to view everything as though you're viewing it through a tinted lens. The man who thinks ideologically is known as an ideologue. The ideologue cares more for ideas than reality. What G.K. Chesterton says of the maniac in his book Orthodoxy is equally true of the ideologue. He is trapped in that clean, well-lit prison of a single idea. The idea always comes before reality. The ideologue unconsciously assumes that everything in the senses originates in the mind. If he is committed to his ideology, he will fail to understand reality. He will even fail to understand an obvious crisis. To understand the nature of a crisis, a man must first perceive the crisis through the senses. He must see it, hear it, feel it, and maybe even smell it. A man knows his house is on fire when he sees the fire. He hears the smoke alarm, he feels extreme heat, and he smells smoke. After perceiving through the senses, he knows in the mind that his house is on fire. In other words, everything in the mind originates in the senses, not the other way around. Western civilization is in crisis right now. Western civilization is like a big estate, a large manor handed down through countless generations in our family, and it's on fire. The so-called conservatives are the guys who are trying to save or conserve different things from the flames. Everybody is grabbing something different. On some level, today's conservatives, today's self-styled conservatives, know something is going wrong, but with their vision obscured by ideology, they don't understand the nature of the crisis or what to conserve. Consider Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, the largest conservative youth group in America. I have loyalty to ideas, proclaimed young Master Kirk. He continues, of course, I love the Grand Canyon, I love the Rocky Mountains, and I love Boston, and I love Chicago. But if all that disappeared and all I had was ideas, and we were on an island, that's America. America is just a placeholder for timeless ideas. And if you fall too in love with the specific place, that's just not what it is. End quote. Imagine that as flames were engulfing your house, your neighbor walked over to you and said, your home is just a placeholder for timeless ideas. And if you fall too in love with the specific place, that's just not what it is. If your neighbor said that to you, you'd probably tell him to get lost. I'd invite him to do, I would invite him to do something anatomically impossible to himself. This is, however, somewhat unfair to Charlie Kirk, no relation to Russell, by the way, in case you were wondering. The ideas Charlie Kirk has in mind, as he explains on various other occasions, are the freedoms and rights codified in the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. How inspiring. Charlie Kirk, like Jonah Goldberg, wants to conserve the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, these are both very practical documents. One is an ordinance of secession from the British Empire. The other is a legal document, a list of laws and political compromises made back in 1787. This would be akin to prioritizing the conserving of an important lawsuit which your grandfather filed. It doesn't really tie you directly to your grandfather, even if the result of the lawsuit was some sort of financial benefit to yourself. Now consider Ben Shapiro of the Daily Wire media empire, one of the largest conservative media companies out there. In December of 2018, Shapiro interviewed political commentator Tucker Carlson. Carlson caused a kerfuffle by saying that certain free market innovations, such as the use of driverless automated delivery trucks, should be restrained by government policy to conserve middle America's way of life. Capitalism is great, said Carlson, but there is no Nicene Creed of capitalism. It is a tool humans use to make money. What blasphemy. How horrific. Shapiro, during the ensuing kerfuffle, posted on Twitter in a since-deleted tweet, quote, anyone who denies the principles of capitalism is not a traditional conservative. Shapiro wants to conserve the tools of wealth-getting. When the house is on fire, this brand of conservative apparently reaches for his tools and maybe some financial documents. Let's consider Marco Rubio, the current Secretary of State. While running for president in 2015, Rubio said that young men studying philosophy would be better off focusing on welding. Technical training in welding, Rubio argued, would yield a greater monetary payoff than contemplating the cosmos. Welders make more money than philosophers, Rubio said. And here's the money line. We need more welders and less philosophers. I mean, I think he meant we need fewer philosophers, not less philosophers, but, we need fewer grammarians and more politicians. Politicians make more money than grammarians. This is like prioritizing the conserving of one's work tools, while deliberately leaving behind to perish in the flames the things that actually tie oneself to one's heritage. The practical tools of money-making are to be saved, as the scrapbook, the family Bible, and various generational heirlooms burn. Today's supposed conservatives do not care to save anything that links us with our patrimony. Such things are impractical, and today's conservatives want to save practical things, legal documents, tools, and financial records. When they urge us to focus on ideas instead of identity, they are urging us to abandon the source of identity, meaning culture. Let culture go up in flames so long as we save our careers. This is not the conservatism of old. Every genuine conservative retains some affection for things traditional, writes Russell Kirk. And tradition is concerned principally with man's cultural world. Kirk explains that tradition joins the individual with the generations that are dead and the generations that are yet to be born. What does a true conservative save when his home is on fire? What would you save if your home were on fire? What did Aeneas save during the burning and sacking of Troy? He took his father, his son, and the household gods. A true conservative saves his family, his parents, wife, and children. Once the people are out, he reaches for the family scrapbook long before he even thinks of his car, his tools, his financial records, or even his wallet. The scrapbook is filled with pictures that remind him of who he is: a son, a father, a husband, an uncle, a Christian, an American, a man. They give him his sense of identity. As Western civilization burns, how do we save Western culture? How do we save those more noble and practical things that link us with our patrimony and give us an identity as Westerners? I say liberal education. Liberal education is akin to the family scrapbook. It passes on the perennial philosophy, yes, but it also passes on Latin and Greek, medieval architecture, Homer and Shakespeare. What else does this? What other institution preserves such things? You might have an idea in your head. I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear your alternative. Liberal education is the only thing left that provides a means of meaningful conservation. That is enough reason why conservatives must support it. There is, however, another reason that conservatives should support liberal education. It becomes apparent when we consider who set the house on fire. Who, in this analogy, you may be wondering, set our house afire? A particular group of people called the liberals. That's who set the house on fire. Now, this is probably very confusing. I was just defending liberal education as a tool for conserving our identity, for saving the most precious parts of our identity from the fire, and now I'm telling you liberals started the fire. Liberals are burning down Western civilization. The word liberal is said in many ways. The liberals are a group of people who denounce every part of man's true identity as an arbitrary hindrance to his ability to craft his own identity as conceived entirely in his own mind. Every man an ideologue. That's what they want. Man, says the liberal, should not be hindered by all these things he didn't choose. Therefore, man must be liberated from such things. The liberal seeks to liberate man by deconstructing and dismissing his identity. In our analogy, he's burning down our house. The liberal has been effective because he seized control of an important institution. Anybody want to guess what the liberal seized control of?
Education.
That's right. Is he one of your students? Well, he's okay. You should keep him.
Yeah.
He seized control of the school, the place of formal education. The liberal did. The purpose of genuine education as understood by liberalism is precisely to liberate the mind from the crippling hold of custom and all non-rational belief, writes the conservative philosopher James Burnham in his magnum opus, The Suicide of the West. I've got a copy right here if you'd like to look at it, by the way. Burnham describes the liberal vision of schooling where the child approaches the altar of education in all his spiritual nakedness as a purely rational being, shorn of color, creed, race, family, and nationality. Inherited folkways, family traditions, and religion are considered by liberalism to be superstitions that obstruct the purely rational being from crafting his own identity. I identify as such and such today. Please use these pronouns. Yes, it's very nice. Burnham's use of religious imagery with the phrase, the altar of education, is very intentional. The school is liberalism's church, as Burnham explains. Just as Catholics consider the Catholic Church as means to achieving paradise in the next world, so do liberals consider the school as means to achieving paradise in this world. Liberals, according to Burnham, do not believe there is any defect in human nature, such as original sin. Therefore, every societal problem can be fixed via education. Liberals believe that man is born ignorant, not wicked, writes Professor J. Salwin Shapiro in his book, Liberalism, Its Meaning and History. Liberals believe that man is born ignorant, not wicked. This means we can eliminate poverty by teaching young men how to make money via technical training. We can likewise eliminate violence via education. We can eliminate greed via education. Prisons can be converted into schools, and police departments can be abolished. The liberal, in denying any inherent defect in man's nature, buys into the perfectibility of man. The means of achieving that perfectibility, that heaven on earth, is formal education. This is why young liberals are more eager to go into teaching than young conservatives. Here we see yet another reason conservatives should start focusing on the academy. By recapturing the academy and restoring liberal education, we can conserve our identity and we can diminish the most powerful tool that liberals have. Liberal education is the solution to education by liberals. Liberals use schooling as a flamethrower to reignite the fire engulfing our house. If conservatives can lead some families, I'm not saying all, but some families away from these schools into liberal arts schools, they can both blunt the flame and rescue something precious from the fire. But one of the big problems is that today's conservatives do not get it. They fail to see who started and who perpetuates this fire. They would have you believe that a small group of eccentric radical intellectuals from Frankfurt, Germany, migrated to the U.S. and conspired to take over American universities and turn them into radical institutions, the radical institutions that we know today. That's the popular explanation given by today's conservative thinkers. I admire some of the people who push this theory, by the way. I just disagree with it. It's bizarre. Christopher Rufo, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, an advisor to Governor Ron DeSantis, is one of the proponents of this Frankfurt School theory. Such elaborate conspiracy theories bear some truth, yes, no doubt. But they draw attention away from the destructive nature of liberalism, which is a much larger cause of this ongoing fire. Today's so-called conservatives favor such conspiracy theories because these conservatives are accustomed to thinking ideologically, and conspiracy theories allow them to do that. A conspiracy theory is an idea held in the mind. The conspiracy theorist uses this idea to explain everything he finds in extramental reality. He cares more about the theory or idea than reality. Recall, Ramesh Ponnuru says, conservatives care about ideas. They run their ideas up the flagpole and see who salutes. They care about ideas, not identity. Ideology traps man in his own head. It blinds him so that he cannot see his own identity, nor can he see who is destroying it. Today's liberals are ideologues, and liberals have always been ideologues, but today's conservatives are also ideologues. This is a problem for true conservatives who wish to conserve identity. The Western world is plagued with ideology, and ideology is the enemy of identity, and therefore the enemy of true conservatism. Conservatism, says Russell Kirk, is the negation of ideology. But Kirk is referring to the activity of conservation, of conserving. That activity entails negating or nullifying ideology. In the sea of ideology in which today's conservative finds himself, there exists one institution that actively negates ideology. It does this by introducing students to great Western thinkers who understood that everything in the mind originates in the senses and not the other way around. This institution is liberal education. The final reason I offer for why conservatives must support liberal education is that it cultivates a certain intellectual habit within the student. Liberal education, according to Russell Kirk, gives the student a philosophic habit of mind. Kirk borrows this term from Discourse 5 of John Henry Cardinal Newman's The Idea of the University. I think he's a saint now, so maybe I should say Saint John Henry Newman's The Idea of the University, the philosophic habit of mind. Now, remember, the ideologue starts his thinking at the wrong end. He starts with his conclusion, his isolated idea, and he looks for things that confirm his isolated idea. By contrast, a man with the philosophic habit of mind begins his thinking by gazing at things in reality. He wonders about them, then he reasons about them, and then he arrives at a conclusion, some new knowledge. The philosophic habit of mind is rightly ordered thinking. A man whose thinking is rightly ordered will not fall into ideology. Such a man notices what Russell Kirk called the permanent things. These are enduring elements of the human condition, rooted in human nature. They include identity. A man endowed with the philosophic habit of mind knows and understands his identity. He knows when it's under attack, and he can see who is responsible. This is what I am saying. There are 3 reasons why conservatives must support liberal education. Number 1, liberal education conserves our identity. Number 2, liberal education undermines those who seek to destroy our identity. And number 3, liberal education lifts the ideological blinders that keep men from recognizing and defending their identity. The task of conservation in our present day necessarily entails supporting liberal education. Those conservatives who do not support it will fail to conserve our Western identity. That is to say, they will fail to conserve anything significant, no matter how many tributes they pay to some abstract idea of freedom or liberty. The words of the great Southern conservative Andrew Lytle come to mind as he writes in his memoir, quote, "To lose your language and your God surrenders all that you are. No matter how many grand abstract words like liberty try to reassure you that you are something or that you have something to lose. You can tell a lot about a man based on what he rescues, what he saves when his house is on fire. You can tell a lot about a man also by what he passes down to posterity. Mainline conservatives today intend to conserve the tools of money-making so that our posterity may achieve a comfortable material existence. They intend also to conserve nearly every legal tool that enables individuals to define their own identity. Anyone who dares restrict wealth getting or fails to adequately sacralize their abstract idea of the day is excommunicated by the doyens of Conservatism Incorporated. Mainline conservatives merely intend to conserve liberalism in an earlier, less radical incarnation, but we have seen this movie before and we know how it ends. What begins with severing man from generations ends with severing man from genitalia. What begins as a project in moderate classical liberalism ends in National Review editors singing paeans to the virtues of drag queen story hour. Conservatives can reject such a future by reasserting identity. The best way to do that is to reclaim and champion liberal education. The late, great Professor John Sr. warns us that when a nation takes nothing but material success as its measure of value, it is led by the mean mediocrity, which has us in its grip, stifling all initiative as we await the more effective aggression of foreign powers motivated by deeper loves and hates who are willing to sacrifice their comforts and even their lives for what they believe. What sort of country would you die for? Would you die for an economic zone? Would you give your life for a country without any sense of kith and kin, without any tie to patrimony? And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? Now, if you'd like, you can ask me a question about this little talk, or you can ask me about anything else. No ceremony, that's all right. No need to clap.